Okay, I don't have much to say about Alfio. There's John.
Hey, John.
I don't think I need to say too much about Alfio to lead up. Old friend of the university as he is. He's here down for today, giving us a talk on John Milius, coming from his book, The Cinema of John Milius, which came out last year.
Self-promotional moment.
Yes, there's the book.
Shall I pass it around so you can have a look?
How much is it?
Too much. The hardcover is always too expensive, but hopefully they will publish a paperback.
We'll paperback version for our handbags.
So go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul. Kia ora koto. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming. It is a great pleasure to be here. As Paul said, today's paper will be based on some of the material published in my book on John Milius last year. I'd like to start by showing you a clip from a sequence that most of you will probably be familiar with, but the sequence will inform some of the things that I will say later in the seminar, so I'll start by showing it to you.
Smell that? You smell that? Napalm, son! Nothing else in the world smells like that! I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You know, one time we had a hail bomb? For 12 hours, when it was all over, I walked up. We didn't find one of them, not one stinking dink body. Smell! You know that gasoline smell? The whole hill. Smells like victory.
This monologue, the monologue you just saw, uttered by Colonel Kilgore in Apocalypse Now, is considered to be one of the most memorable speeches in film history. Although most critical discussions about Apocalypse Now tend to focus on Francis Ford Coppola's heroic authorism, the author of that monologue and many other iconic moments in the film is a somewhat less known filmmaker, John Milius. Milius has been one of the most influential and controversial figures in the history of American cinema. Along with the likes of Coppola, George Lucas, and Martin Scorsese, he was a central exponent of the so-called New Hollywood, a period in American film history spanning from the mid-60s to the early 1980s, characterized by an anti-establishment, formally innovative approach to filmmaking. During this period, Milius achieved international fame as the creator of cinematic icons such as Jeremiah Johnson and Derry Harry. Throughout the 1970s, Milius gained further notoriety for his work on the script of Apocalypse Now, for which he also received an Academy Award nomination. Milius used his success to develop a mythology of his favorite sport, surfing, in both Apocalypse Now and Big Wednesday, one of the most influential cult films about surfing ever made. In the early 1980s, Milius contributed to launching Arnold Schwarzenegger's career by casting him in Conan the Barbarian, and became a poster boy for conservative Hollywood by directing the hyper-violent anti-communist war epic Red Dawn. More recently, Milius was credited with the creation of the HBO series Rome and the invention of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC. A self-proclaimed right-wing Zen anarchist, throughout his career, Milius has taken provocative stances on guns, American imperialism, and war, which often earned him the scorn of famous film critics. Pauline Kael, in particular, frequently wrote scathing reviews of his films, defining him both a bad storyteller and a representative of the industry's fascism and amorality. Milius blamed the hostility of the Hollywood liberal establishment towards his political leanings for the gradual decline of his filmmaking career since the early 1990s. He often said, "I've been blacklisted for a large part of my career because of my politics, as surely as any writer was blacklisted back in the 1950s. Although his decline was more likely the consequence of an unfortunate combination of illnesses and commercial failures rather than actual political blacklist, Milius' directorial career did virtually end in the late 1990s. Despite his disappearance from the contemporary Hollywood industry, however, Milius' legacy is still alive. The bear surfboard logo, which Milius created for Big Wednesday, has become a popular sport brand. The Coen brothers paid homage to the writer-director by basing the character of Walter Sobchak, the hyper-conservative, gun-toting veteran of the Big Lebowski, on Milius. In 2003, the American military dubbed the operation that led to the capture of Saddam Hussein Operation Red Dawn, after the eponymous film directed by Milius. In 2017, controversial former deputy assistant to the White House, Sebastian Gorka, compared Donald Trump's success against Hillary Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign to the victory of the Wolverines against the communist invaders in Red Dawn. Gorka is not the only conservative politician to have cited Milius films, which have been celebrated and appropriated by alt-right and conservative movements all around the world. It is undeniable that Milius' cinematic oeuvre, characterized by a peculiar portrayal of hypermasculinity and violence, the yearning for a lost golden age, and the pessimistic rejection of the modern world, aligns with the nostalgic connotations of Trump's Make America Great Again ideological platform. Similarly, it would not be implausible to argue that the deep distrust in bureaucrats and the establishment, which animates all the films directed by Milius, prepared the terrain for the success of the deeply anti-system MAGA campaign, which in turn was made possible by a generation of middle-aged white Americans who looked back fondly at the 1980s, and particularly, 1980s films such as Conan and Red Dawn. Interestingly, the latest season of Stranger Things, which is a TV show that capitalizes on the nostalgia for the 1980s, was a mega homage to Red Dawn. I don't know how many of you have seen Stranger Things 3. I don't want to spoil it for you, but lots of references to Red Dawn and implicitly Milius as well. Milius' own controversial political statements, informed by a radical conservatism which goes beyond the mainstream left-right divide, seem to echo Trump's electoral provocations. In 2009, for example, referring to his idea to stop murderous drug traffickers in Mexico, Milius stated, "We need to go down there, kill them all, flatten the place with bulldozers, so when you wake up in the morning, there is nothing there." I do believe if you have a military, you use it. And yet, it would be unfair to label Milius as a mere conservative filmmaker subservient to the American pro-military lobby. Milius was a pioneer of the new Hollywood, and his work is infused by a strange and intriguing combination of the new and the old, tradition and avant-garde. His style manages to bring together an eclectic set of influences: Melville and Kerouac, Conrad and the Doors, Kipling and Kurosawa. Similarly, his films are animated by seemingly irreconcilable contradictions: surfing and the Vietnam War, violence and pacifism, the celebration of an inward-looking reactionary America, and a radical curiosity for the outside world. Milius' ability to simultaneously subvert and continue the tradition of classical Hollywood cinema makes him the perfect representative of a third way in post-classical Hollywood, which is different from both the Lucas Spielberg turn, characterized by an emphasis on blockbuster franchise and special effects, and the East Coast auteur cinema of Martin Scorsese, Paul Schrader, and so on. Film critics have often overlooked the complexity of Milius' cinematic oeuvre, which is characterized by a distinctive authorial signature and a consistent set of stylistic and thematic concerns. Similarly, within academia, very few film scholars have engaged with a critical analysis of Milius' work. This paper examines the stylistic strategies deployed by Milius to articulate some of the recurring themes in his cinematic oeuvre, in particular the nostalgia for a lost idyllic past and the fascination with violence and barbarism. Violence and nostalgia are common tropes of the new Hollywood movement to which Milius belonged to. However, in his films, these tropes are inflected by his personal style and political beliefs. The auteurist study of the formal and thematic characteristics of selected Milius films will be complemented by the examination of the ideological nature of his body of work. The cinema of John Milius provides a very interesting case study as it represents a useful starting point to articulate a more nuanced approach to right-wing politics in American cinema, detailing the fault lines between different forms of conservative discourse. Furthermore, the examination of Milius' body of work from an auteurist perspective sheds new light on the tension between personal creative vision and industrial modes of filmmaking. To this end, I will look at the way in which Milius mobilized extreme political discourses to develop a distinguishable and marketable authorial persona. John Milius was born in 1944 to a Jewish family in Missouri. When he was 7, his family moved to California, where he became an avid surfer. During his adolescence, Milius dreamed of a military career. However, when he volunteered for Vietnam service in the late 1960s, he was rejected due to chronic asthma. He briefly considered becoming a historian or an artist. However, after attending a Kurosawa retrospective, he decided to study film at the University of Southern California. Milius was part of a group of early American film graduates, which also included George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, who often collaborated and influenced each other. Here's a picture of a young Milius with Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, for example. After graduating from USC, Milius was employed as a writer by American International Pictures, or AIP, a production company that specialized on low-budget action and horror films. Milius' major break into the industry, however, was represented by the sale of the script of Jeremiah Johnson to Warner Brothers. Shortly afterwards, Milius worked on the drafts of both Dirty Harry and its sequel, Magnum Force. In the early 1970s, Francis Ford Coppola contracted Milius to write Apocalypse Now, which would eventually become one of the most critically acclaimed films in the history of cinema. During this period, Milius also collaborated with other members of the New Hollywood movement, such as Steven Spielberg, for whom he wrote the famous USS Indianapolis monologue in Jaws. Milius' reputation as a screenwriter eventually led to his directorial debut with Dillinger, a gangster film about the life and criminal exploits of notorious bank robber John Dillinger. 2 years later, Milius wrote and directed The Wind and the Lion, which blended historical facts into a fictional confrontation between Moroccan bandit El Raizuli, played by Sean Connery, and US President Theodore Roosevelt, one of Milius' favorite heroes. The commercial success of both Dillinger and The Wind and the Lion allowed Milius to get backing for a more personal project, Big Wednesday, a surfing film loosely based on his own life, a film that celebrates friendship and lost youth. Big Wednesday was a major disappointment at the box office, but eventually found a cult audience after its theatrical release. In the early 1980s, Milius achieved his greatest commercial success with Conan the Barbarian, the film which launched Schwarzenegger's acting career, and also Red Dawn, a popular yet controversial tale about a group of American teenagers taking on guerrilla warfare to resist a communist invasion of the United States. The film outraged liberal critics, or most liberal critics, and reinforced Milius' reputation as a conservative filmmaker. Red Dawn was followed by 2 films set respectively during World War II and the Vietnam War, Farewell to the King in 1989 and The Flight of the Intruder in 1991. Both films proved to be major commercial failures and marked the decline of Milius' directorial career. From the late 1990s, Milius became increasingly involved in television productions, writing and directing Rough Riders, a miniseries about Theodore Roosevelt, and co-creating and co-producing the popular cable series Rome. In 2010, Milius had a stroke that left him unable to speak and walk. However, he's gradually recovering from it. Milius films often explore the values of tradition, adventure, spiritualism, honor, and loyalty. His stories tend to focus on heroic, legendary figures such as Dillinger or Conan. Milius consistently creates a mythical aura around the protagonists of his films. The surfers of Big Wednesday, for example, are titanic figures which seem to embody Aryan perfection. Conan is an extraordinary individual characterized by superhuman strength. In his films, characters such as the Wolverines, Dillinger, or Jeremiah Johnson become living legends whose courage and strength is often explicitly acknowledged by their own enemies. Milius' interest in superhuman characters played a crucial role in the emergence of the so-called hard-body film, a subcategory of the action genre which showcases hyper-masculine characters, usually played by bodybuilder actors, engaged in various feats of heroism. Notable for their excessive violence and hyperbolic action, hard-body films such as Conan the Barbarian focus on the sculpted muscularity and physical prowess of the body of the male hero. Conan, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, would eventually become a prototype masculine figure in both hard-body action films and the sword and sorcery genre in particular. Milius' depiction of hypermasculinity has often been interpreted as a direct reflection of the conservative ideals of aggressive and hyper-individualistic masculinity espoused by the Reagan administration during the 1980s. Milius' construction of superhuman heroes, however, is also reminiscent of the ideas of traditionalist right-wing philosophers such as Julius Evola, who called for the reawakening of spiritualism and heroic ideals through war. Milius himself claimed that the main theme in his oeuvre could be defined as a sort of enthusiasm for the struggle. What are we supposed to do, he said. Are we supposed to be happy? I don't think so. I think we're supposed to put up a good fight. Milius often follows the protagonist on an initiation journey during which they need to overcome a series of overwhelming obstacles that will deeply transform them. In some cases, these obstacles take the form of large contingents of enemies. In Conan, Red Dawn, or Jeremiah Johnson, for example, the protagonists are severely outnumbered, and yet they eventually prevail. At times, these hurdles are represented by vast natural spaces: the desert in The Wind and the Lion, the ocean in Big Wednesday, the mountains in Red Dawn, and the jungle in both Farewell to the King and Apocalypse Now. The ethic of Milius' universe is condensed in the Nietzschean epigraph that opens Conan the Barbarian. That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Whether they are lone trappers, marine deserters, or young surfers, all Milius' characters gradually acquire self-awareness of their place in the world after a cruel struggle against both nature and society. Milius' stories revolve around the radical psychological transformation of his protagonists. Violence is an essential step in the maturation process of Milius' heroes, who often must choose between death and murder. Ultraviolence was a common trope of the new Hollywood era, and it is an essential thematic ingredient of all of Milius' films. Only when Conan is made gladiator, forced to kill people and applauded by the masses, he finds what the voiceover calls a sense of self-worth. Milius' violence is particularly brutal and relentless. At the time of its release, Red Dawn was considered to be the most violent film in the history of cinema by the Guinness Book of Records, with a rate of 134 acts of violence per hour, or 2.2 per minute. The representation of violence in Milius' films is characterized by a clear stylistic approach. Milius avoids both the use of slow motion popularized in the 1970s by directors such as Peckinpah, and also the depiction of gruesome, sadistic violence acts, which are the trademark of other conservative filmmakers such as Mel Gibson. According to Stephen Prince, although Milius' first film, Dillinger, deals with some of the same themes addressed in Arthur Penn's 1967 Bonnie and Clyde, which is considered to be one of the first films of the new Hollywood era, Milius shuns the graphic realism of Penn's films, opting instead for a more restrained, Fordian approach to violence. In Milius' films, violence is generally omnipresent, ubiquitous, but also rapid and over soon. Shootings typically occur at a distance, and the violent act is clean, impersonal, and devoid of emotional power, as this sequence from Red Dawn demonstrates.
Разбей бензин. Хорошо. Девочка, что ты делаешь здесь? Красивая.
Побить, бычку, вас выбрало.
Девочка, куда ты идешь? Ты такая красавица. Подожди, девочка, куда ты идешь? Что случилось с тобой? Пойдем. Run this way. All right.
Приготовиться. Прицелайтесь. Поворот.
Wolverines! Подъезда! Подъезда! Снайпер!
So plenty of violent acts in Red Dawn. However, most of these acts are seen from a distance and devoid of much emotional power. Occasionally, however, violence becomes much more graphic and bloody, particularly during one-on-one confrontations in which the hero is supposed to test or demonstrate his or her strength, mainly his strength. This particular sequence from Conan is a case in point.
He did not care anymore. Life and death the same. Only that the crowd would be there to greet him with howls of lust and fury. He began to realize his sense of worth. He mattered.
Conan's gladiator scenes provided a blueprint, at least in visual terms, for the invention of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC, which has often been criticized for its extreme violence and brutality. Milius himself was a practitioner of martial arts and a student of Roy Gracie, the co-founder of the UFC. Milius was nominated artistic director of UFC and was responsible for developing some of the trademarks of the sport, including the idea of holding the competition inside the cage. The initial plan had been to surround the cage with a moat full of alligators, but there was also an idea to electrify the chain link fence, but of course these plans were eventually discarded for logistical reasons. Milius' passion for gladiatorial combat continued to follow him throughout his creative career, and it was particularly apparent in the Rome TV series, which features several gladiatorial scenes. Despite its brutal, barbaric nature, Milius' violence is often framed within a rough honor code. Milius said, in relation to violence in his films, "I like Kurosawa violence, John Ford violence, violence that takes place within a code. I'm Japanese at heart. I live by the kendo code of Bushido, honor, and skill. All my characters have their codes." Milius' fight scenes are often inspired by some of his favorite films and directors. In Conan the Barbarian, for example, the eponymous character learns his sword skills from an Oriental samurai-type master, a nod to the cinema of Kurosawa. You don't see him very well, but he's right there. The traditional, Oriental samurai-type master. Similarly, the battle among the burial mounds in which Conan faces dozens of enemies is a reference to the final confrontation in the Seven Samurai. Sometimes the sources of Milius' inspiration subvert his reputation as a hyper-conservative filmmaker. The opening sequences of Conan the Barbarian, in which Tulsadum's army pillages and destroys Conan village, reference the beginning of Alexander Nevsky, in which the Teutonic German knights conquer and massacre the population of the city of Pskov. Alexander Nevsky, directed by Eisenstein during a period of strain between the USSR and Nazi Germany, celebrates Russian resistance and is usually considered to be a quintessential anti-fascist film. Some critics have considered the representation of violence in Milius' films as an expression of his fascist tendencies. In his review of Conan the Barbarian, for example, Roger Ebert claimed that he was disturbed by the depiction of a Nordic Superman confronting a black, because the main villain, Tulsadum, is played by James Earl Jones, in which the muscular blonde slices off the black man's head and contemptuously throws it down the flight of stairs. Similarly, Red Dawn received scathing reviews for its explicit anti-communist message. Other critics, however, have suggested that violence in Milius' films can be read as ideologically ambiguous. Douglas Kellner, for example, suggests that while Red Dawn advances an anti-communist position, which specifically reproduces fears the Reagan administration constantly played on, it also celebrates the audacity of communist revolutionaries. Red Dawn opens with a shot of a monument displaying a quote by American ultra-imperialist President Theodore Roosevelt, which goes, "Far better is it to dare mighty things than to take rank with those poor timid spirits who know neither victory nor defeat." While the communist invaders clearly play the role of villains in the film, the full-scale invasion of the USA, shown at the beginning of the film, could be interpreted as a sort of mighty daring that Roosevelt, and in turn Milius, through Roosevelt's quote, praise. Similarly, the heroism of certain communist characters, such as Bella and Strelnikov, is presented in a sympathetic light. Incidentally, the figure of Strelnikov, the leader of the Russian Special Forces, is clearly inspired by Colonel Mathieu, the French paratrooper commander and former resistance member sent to crush the anti-imperialist revolt in the Battle of Algiers. In an interesting reversal of ideological positions, by showing the transformation of a small group of teenagers into partisan resistance fighters, Milius recuperates for the right the figure of the heroic leftist freedom fighters such as Che Guevara and the Viet Cong, at the time in which the US was supporting anti-communist guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan and Nicaragua. The ideological ambiguity of Red Dawn is also highlighted in Andrew Kopkin's review of the film for The Nation. Shortly after its release, Kopkin defined the film as a celebration of people's war. Milius has produced, Kopkin said, Milius has produced the most convincing story about popular resistance to imperial oppression since the inimitable Battle of Algiers. He has only admiration for his guerrilla kids, and he understands their motivations and excuses their naivete far better than the hip liberal filmmakers of the 1960s counterculture. Milius' anti-communist project is undercut by the celebration of both the anti-imperialist values of the Wolverines and the imperialist might of the communists. Violence in Milius' films transcends the ideological allegiance of the characters and could be defined as metapolitical. German historian and philosopher Ernst Nolte defined the metapolitical dimension as the set of grand ideas such as war, modernity, etc., that transcend the mere political level. Milius himself claimed that I actually like left-wing radicals, I don't like liberals. Whether you're a right-wing or a left-wing anarchist, you're probably throwing the same bomb. In Red Dawn, both the communist invaders and the American guerrilla fighters commit brutal acts of violence, and the difference between the two sides becomes increasingly blurred. As the Wolverines are about to execute a prisoner of war, one teenage guerrilla asks, "What's the difference between us and them?" To which the leader's only feeble response is, "We live here." For Milius, violence is a purifying element responsible for returning mankind to its original state, barbarism. Milius thus describes the original script of Apocalypse Now. It is about a descent to savagery, or an ascent into savagery, depending on how you look at it. Kurtz has a line, "Yes, I have descended, but I have become much greater for the descent." Similarly, the most famous speech in the film, or quote, or line, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," uttered by Kilgore after a destructive helicopter ride, refers to the exhilarating, revitalizing effect of violence and war on soldiers' minds. Milius' heroes are either barbarians like Conan, or gradually regress to savagery after a brutal confrontation with nature and their enemies. Jeremiah Johnson leaves the civilized world to become a mountain man and eventually a ruthless warrior feared and respected by local savages. Kurtz, in Apocalypse Now, rejects the hypocritical rules of the American army to become the king of a tribe of heathens. The UFC was conceived as a primal battle between barbarians. Milius regards savagery as an essential element of the American character. "I tend to like the savagery," he says. "I like that about Americans. We have a tremendous energy and vitality. To disguise this or to be ashamed of it is despicable." The protagonists and the antagonists of Milius' stories are both barbarians. And Dirty Harry, the only difference between the killer, the serial killer, and the cop, Dirty Harry, is the fact that the latter has a badge. In Red Dawn, the American Wolverines need to become mountain men and regress to a condition of semi-barbarism in order to effectively contrast the communist invaders. In turn, Milius sets up the Soviet soldiers as barbaric hordes by introducing them after a high school teacher who's lecturing on Gengis Khan is shot by the invaders. Gengis Khan, as a quintessential barbarian, is a recurring figure in Milius' work, who, among other things, worked on a script for a film about the Mongol warrior, which was never made. The line that summarizes Conan's aspirations in life to crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women was inspired by a similar quote attributed to Gengis Khan. Milius' fascination for barbarism is inextricably connected to a nostalgia for a lost golden age. He often claimed that the world I admire was dead before I was born. In Milius' films, civilization is often a synonym of corruption, weakness, and decadence. It is by regressing into savagery that the protagonists recover traditional values of courage, loyalty, and heroism. From this point of view, Milius' conception of history is influenced by conservative theories of civilization, such as Spengler's views on the decline of the West. Spengler's civilization model postulates that any civilization is a superorganism with a limited and predictable lifespan, which is inevitably destined to decline. Like Spengler, Milius' cinematic oeuvre is informed by a pessimism and nostalgia for a lost age of purity. Milius' stories are often set during a transitional period, the end of an era, the passing of a more innocent time to a more corrupt and complex one. Unfriedberg states that nostalgia, from Greek nostos, a return, and algos, painful, means a painful return, a longing for something far away or long ago, separated by distance and time. The etymological history of the word nostalgia demonstrates that its first usage in the 17th century referred to the idea of homesickness. Several Milius stories are often driven by nostalgia, and the protagonist's often symbolical attempt to return home. In Milius' films, the mythical place of origins may take different forms. In Dillinger, for example, home is represented quite literally by the old house of the protagonist's father. Sometimes, however, this idealized locus is the frontier, the physical and symbolical home of the authentic American character, according to Milius. It is only by going back to a frontier lifestyle that the Wolverines in Red Dawn or Jeremiah Johnson in the eponymous film manage to find the strength and vitality necessary to defeat their enemies. In Apocalypse Now and Farewell to the King, the rejection of the modern world is counterbalanced by the nostalgia for a simpler, traditional world represented by tribes of so-called savages. The HBO TV show Rome, created by Milius, juxtaposes the stern morality and traditional values of the Roman Republic to the corruption and decadence that characterizes the rising Roman Empire. In the show, for those of you who have seen it, the honorable and severe character of Lucius Varinus embodies the nostalgia for the Republic, which he regards as the golden age of Roman history. Milius' films frequently feature heroic yet anachronistic characters such as Varinus, who are destined to disappear in the new order of things. Milius' interest in anachronistic characters and nostalgia more broadly could be considered to be in line with his extreme right-wing beliefs. According to Hutchins, nostalgia is fundamentally conservative in its praxis as it aims to keep things as they were. However, while Milius' nostalgia is essentially anti-modern, it is also trans-ideological, as it cannot be associated with a specific political position. The nostalgic celebration of friendship and the critique of a capitalist industrial society in Big Wednesday, for example, could be easily read as either a left or right-wing appraisal of the contemporary world. Milius' nostalgia is also concerned with his personal longing for a specific stylistic form, classical Hollywood. Like many other exponents of the New Hollywood era, Milius had an extensive knowledge of film history, and he often explicitly acknowledged his debt towards classical Hollywood, and particularly to the cinema of John Ford. Milius was particularly obsessed with The Searchers, one of Ford's best-known films, which he regularly referenced in the movies that he directed. In Dillinger, for example, Milius reproduces the first scene of The Searchers in visual terms. Similarly, in The Wind and the Lion, a soldier plays a part of the score from The Searchers on a harmonica. The style and themes of Milius' cinematic oeuvre, particularly a nostalgic yearning for anti-modern purity, a celebration of physical strength, individualism and heroism, a certain fascination for violence and barbarism, may be easily read as a reflection of hyper-conservative ethic and beliefs. The close analysis of his cinematic oeuvre, however, reveals that the mobilization of certain themes in Milius' work sometimes produces ideologically ambiguous results. Films such as Conan the Barbarian or Red Dawn are not partisan movies. It is not political scenarios that attract Milius, but pre-political ones. He is drawn to landscapes where there is no law, no sovereign, no state. His characters either oppose the dominant order or exist outside it entirely. The relationships that most interest Milius are not political. His solitary protagonists enter into attachments not out of biological or ideological loyalties, but out of sentiment, memory, and place. Similarly, the foregrounding of violence and nostalgia in Milius' films is not deployed to advocate for specific political positions, but it is rather metapolitical, as I was saying earlier, transcending the ideological allegiance of the characters. The foregrounding of heroism and violence in films such as Red Dawn or Farewell to the King is undermined by the lack of happy ending and an implicit anti-war message. Likewise, despite its apparent machismo, Conan the Barbarian broke new ground in terms of the depiction of female roles in adventure movies. In the film, Conan's lover, Valeria, played by Sandal Beckerman here, is the most active character and the real driving force of the narrative, thus paving the way for other fantasy heroines such as Xena Warrior Princess. The metapolitical nature of Milius' films might explain the fact that these films resonate with large audiences who include both liberals and conservatives. Milius himself entertained close personal and professional relationships with liberal filmmakers such as Coppola, George Lucas, Oliver Stone, and so on. Some of them paid homage to Milius by using him as a source of inspiration for some of their cinematic characters. For example, the character of John Milner in American Graffiti, or Walter Sobchak, that we already mentioned in The Big Lebowski. At the stylistic level, Milius' fascism is self-consciously confined to the world of fantasy. Milius himself, for example, described Red Dawn as a comic book adventure. Milius' cinema is not anchored to reality, but rather the traditions of classical studio genres. In his films, Milius manipulates and radicalizes certain tropes of classical Hollywood with revolutionary, excessive consequences. So, for example, Ford's solitary, virile hero becomes hyper-masculine and hyper-violent. Likewise, Ford's conservatism becomes Milius' fascism. Rather than rejecting the critics' scornful accusations of fascism, Milius often publicly embraced them. This mobilization of controversial political discourses, however, has less to do with advancing specific political agendas than constructing for himself a colorful persona associated with extreme, provocative stances, what Paul Schrader defines as the art of flash, the flamboyant gesture or the deft hyperbole. Milius, for example, said, in relation to his own political beliefs, "I'm not a reactionary. I'm just a right-wing extremist so far beyond the Christian identity people that they can't even imagine. I'm so far beyond that, I'm a Maoist. I'm an anarchist. I've always been an anarchist." Similarly, when an interviewer asked him, "What would you do if an actor wouldn't get up for morning call?" Milius replied, "I shoot him in the legs and photograph him from the waist up." Milius has consciously attempted to link his cinematic aesthetic of excess with his own excessive artistic persona to position himself as a rebel, as an outsider within Hollywood. In interviews, Milius often situated himself outside the establishment by claiming that Hollywood executives blacklist him because of his politics. Throughout his career, Milius entertained a complex, problematic relationship with Hollywood. The intense conflicts between Milius and studio bureaucrats culminated with the former allegedly pointing a gun at a studio executive have become the stuff of Hollywood legend. However, colorful anecdotes aside, these tensions reflect an essential characteristic of Milius' career, namely an opposition to the Hollywood profit-driven establishment. In an interview, he said, "We were very much concerned with making the Hollywood film, not to make a lot of money, but as artists." Milius often regarded himself as one of the barbarians that populated his films, a threat to the Hollywood system. So Milius has proved to be a rebellious auteur with a distinctive stylistic signature who has the merit of challenging the Hollywood establishment both at the thematic and aesthetic level. However, at the same time, Milius has consciously used his position of outsider to build himself as a marketable brand with significant currency in the mass media system. Scholars such as Timothy Corrigan have noted how the film industry has appropriated the notion of auteur for economic purposes by producing marketable packages that capitalize on the popularity of the director's name. According to Corrigan, the function of the auteur has rematerialized in the 80s and 90s as a commercial performance of the business of being auteur. Milius is no exception to this rule. Since the mid-1980s, his name has become synonym of radical politics, extreme violence, and brutal machismo. Recently, Milius' brand has been used to market a profitable pay-per-view martial arts competition, UFC, but also TV shows, books, and video games. For example, Homefront, which is a video game based on the narrative premise of Red Dawn. From this point of view, the trajectory of Milius' career seems to suggest that although he portrayed himself as a rebel, an enemy of the studio system that he was allegedly trying to fight, he gradually became an integral part of the very establishment he was allegedly trying to overthrow. And I'm conscious of the time, so I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you.